Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Omnia Performance Podcast with myself, Fergus Crawley.
Myself, Johnny P.
Myself,
Big Johnny P.
Dr. Phil Price. Go on, I did it then, so.
He did it. He did it.
Well, we chastised him in the last one for not calling himself Dr. Phil Price and just calling himself the measly Phil Price.
Such an average name.
Mr. Phil Price.
Doesn't stand out at all.
PP.
PP, yeah, that was on all over my rugby kit when I played as a teenager. PP.
PP was
Yeah.
all over your rubber
Well,
kit. Yeah.
not the actual PP, the initials.
You fucking walked right into that one, didn't you?
I can't imagine a teenage rugby team with somebody having PP all over their rugby kit. I mean, yeah, there's so many angles here. I think, let's not bully Phil today, Johnny. There's no need to go down this road, as we are very much tapping into Phil's expertise today as we unpack all of the things that we believe are missing in the realm of research around hybrid training or concurrent training. But before we do that, you need to assess what's missing in your life by seeing whether or not you've hit follow or subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on. I can see Johnny's
That was
face.
good.
Oh, thank you.
Was it good?
No, that was great. Yeah, so obviously, I mean, yeah,
Like I was
I've
watching
lost the
Tony
dressing
Robbins
room here I've lost the dressing room by sniggering at Johnny sniggering. It's my seamless segue there. But just hit follow or subscribe. Tell your friends about this podcast. Share it with them. Rate the show 5 stars and leave a review if you would be so kind. Check us out on YouTube and check out the description down below where there are lots of things to click on and do stuff with. Thank you very much. So, Phil, for anyone that might be new around here, do you just want to give a top-line summary of who you are in the world of academia and research?
So, I've been teaching at university, St Mary's University, for over 13 years now. I got my PhD back in 2018. It took me 5 years to do it, but it's technically in bioengineering. So ultimately, what a PhD is just a process to teach you research skills to become a researcher. And by doing that, you end up, ideally, you become a very someone that knows a lot in a particular area. I sometimes feel that people think once you've done a PhD, you're an expert in that particular area. Like, when you get to the end of the PhD, you realise you're not, because the more you learn, the more you realise, I know it's cliche, the more you realise you don't know. But ultimately, what a PhD is just to learn research skills to further your career in research. So now I've been furthering my career in research alongside my teaching at St Mary's University, where I guess part of my research I'm trying to develop is on concurrent training, hybrid training, all that type of thing. Got some good undergraduate and master's projects going on in that area at the moment. And I also do some work, which I don't know if I've ever spoken about it on a Omnia Performance podcast yet, but my work with looking at jumping with astronauts as a training method in microgravity. So that's research that's been supported by the UK Space Agency. So 2 very different areas, but I like that. So I guess my research experience technically I'm still an early career researcher because of where I am. You know, if you compare me to someone that's a professor that has his own lab and they have his or her own lab and they have, you know, a number of different postdocs, PhD people underneath them, you know, that's probably like a much further end career person. I would still be early career researcher. So that's me.
But you are currently a senior lecturer in biomechanics and
Strength and conditioning.
Strength and conditioning
Yeah.
at St Mary's, aren't you?
Mm-hmm.
So with that in mind, this is why you've been on the podcast for so long, and if you're new around here, there are lots of episodes with Dr. Phil sharing his expertise with us to go back and listen to. But with all that in mind, that is essentially why Dr. Phil is here, so that we can explore where the research aligns with how we program, how we theorize, how we put things together, what the research hasn't yet shown, but doesn't also disprove, because it's very often that you say, well, there's no research that supports that, but there might not be any research that disproves it either, which doesn't mean the same thing. And I think that's an important misconception to clear up. And then I have a bit of a disdain for everything being qualified by what the science says, because science is ever changing, it's evolving, and there's lots of things to consider, and it all needs to be taken within its context, which is where Phil's been fantastic, because he forces us to look at the wider context of studies and how things should be considered. And the biggest focus we've really had on is on the interference effect, because that's the research in our space, quote unquote hybrid training, that gets called out the most, because there's a meta-analysis on it. So that is where people tend to go whenever research, quote unquote, comes up in conversation around hybrid or concurrent training. And that's because this is a new and emerging section of the fitness industry, in the same way that CrossFit, in the grand scheme of things, is a new and emerging section of the fitness industry. But it does mean that in the past couple of years, there's been a lot more research coming through than there was in 2009, when it was quite embryonic, for example. So the question today really is, Phil, what research is there? But more importantly, what research isn't there? Because we would love to know what you think is missing to help reinforce a lot of the ideas that are essentially empirically proven through what people are achieving in the realm of hybrid training.
Yeah, cool. So I definitely think you can go two ways with this. One that I'll answer here because I think it's most related to this question, but the other way is how research is interpreted and perceived, especially in, let's say, in social media. Because like you said, like the terms get thrown around, like, oh, have you got a PubMed reference to that or something like that? If you give like a certain opinion, which seems really weird to me. Like if I have a certain opinion, it's not based on one study. It's probably based on a lot of reading and personal experience. But, you know, that seems to be the popular way of doing things, which I don't really agree with. So in terms of for hybrid training or concurrent training, let's go to the meta-analyses. So there's been quite a few now in hybrid training. You're ready for a fight. There's been quite a few in hybrid training, especially that came out in the last, I'd say, 5 years, and I'm sure there's going to be several more that will come out soon. The more research that happens, the more, more meta-analysis occur. Really, and a meta-analysis should happen every 5 years to update itself in a particular topic. And funny enough, loads of meta-analyses came out during COVID because no one could actually do any lab testing. So people were like, well, how am I going to further my research career? Obviously, it's a meta-analysis. So the issue that
I hadn't considered that. That's a very good point.
Yeah, it happened.
It was just quick subcategory question before you move on. Sorry to cut you off, but do you think that reduced the value or validity of some of the meta-analyses that were created because they were sort of born out of necessity rather than desire?
Possibly. It kind of, a lot of the time with a meta-analysis, they kind of happen at the beginning of a PhD. And the reason behind that is that someone is reviewing all of the research in a particular area so they can find the gaps, so they can then structure a PhD based on what is needed. So quite often the results of the meta-analysis is, okay, this is what we think is happening because of these studies have shown this. All of these studies here have poor quality because you're essentially going through each study with a fine tooth comb and you're grading it based on a number of methodological issues. So you're identifying not only gaps, but you're trying to identify where the research is weak. So you could then create methods in further studies that don't make these mistakes again. So if you're doing that too rushed, or you're just doing it because you want to get a publication out there, you may just be skewering the question so that your meta-analysis appears different but isn't really that different from other meta-analyses. That did happen quite a bit. So I think they're all relevant, but that doesn't mean that some researchers might have done that just purely to try and progress their research career rather than actually do it to find out what we need and then go from there.
Okay.
But
thank you for the tangent.
Yeah, no worries. But yeah, meta-analyses are a tricky one because technically, if you're going to have a good conclusion of what you should do for a particular style of training, a meta-analysis is probably the best study to take advice from because they are combining the results of many studies. The issue we have is when people don't go into the weeds and actually look at the studies which formulate the answer of that meta-analysis. So if you have an answer of a meta-analysis, it says do this, but all of the studies were absolute shit. That means the do this is probably shit as well. So, we need to be careful when we just go like, here's a meta-analysis, that's all you need to know, because it might not actually say everything that we need. And I think that's really happened with hybrid training, because a lot of the studies are using either very novice athletes, or the training programs themselves are very small and controlled, which is fine because it needs to be controlled so you can understand if there is a statistical difference, what made that change, but they don't necessarily reflect what you're doing, Fergus. So we then make this, we got this conclusion that says, there's no interference effect, but it's used with predominantly novice athletes where if you do anything with them, they improve. So we've got to be very clear where we need to be critical of these meta-analyses, even though they're seen as the not the pinnacle of research, but they are the finding the hard way of describing it. If you've got your research pyramid, they're at the top of the research pyramid.
But research isn't just the pyramid. There's context around the pyramid. The sand around the pyramids, and the sand is what makes the research useful, essentially. So I got my phone up in the background there. I wasn't just being a rude bastard, but got my phone up in the background there because this morning, yesterday, the World Health Organization said that non-nutritive sweeteners were basically non-recommended by the World Health Organization. And the reason they listed for that was because in the long term, they don't result in long-term weight loss when replacing sugar, i.e. soda beverages or sort of full sugar alternatives. But when you look at the research, there is not a single diet intervention metric that is research backed that in the long term unequivocally solves that equation. So essentially the reason for not recommending non-nutritive sweeteners as not a good thing by the World Health Organization could in the same vein be used to say that exercise and calorie control is not recommended in the long term. So it just goes to show that in the way that you can cherry pick things and then sort of create a narrative around it, and then people will take their own perceptions from it and then spin it off in another direction is a good example. But this is happening at a very macro level, whereby, BioLane did a really good sort of post on it, but essentially reading it out loud here, using their metrics for success, you can also conclude a caloric deficit doesn't result in long-term weight loss. That's because over the long term, diets have a horrible success rate for weight loss. Why? Because most people do not sustain the intervention. Same applies here. So what's happened is that the World Health Organization have clearly looked at one specific component of that pyramid and thought, let's apply that to a wider rule without, to circle back, looking at all the sand, which is the human behavioral patterns that go with long-term nutritional considerations. And I know that's nutrition side of things, but this is where it's important to come back to the sort of meta-analyses in hybrid training and current training, because so many people will take one element of that meta-analysis, one element of another study, and just take that as their North Star and run everything off that thought process. When in reality, it's not as black and white as that, is it?
Yeah, it would be really limited to just take such a big recommendation off of one particular study, even if it is a meta-analysis. Quite a lot of the time when it's some kind of governing body that's making these guidelines, usually they've consulted all the research, and you'll notice those papers have like 20 different authors. It's because they've got the experts in the area to make these guidelines. So you'd like to think that by doing that, you are incorporating knowledge of all the research that's been done so far and all of the practical experience of all of those experts in the area. So it's quite surprising the short-sightedness of that particular issue. Like, obviously, I'm not a nutritionist or dietitian, but that does seem like a very poor way of doing things, or they're missing the point, or haven't even bothered to look further into it. But you'll also be surprised. It'll be interesting to how they reported it as well, because you get a governing body that will recommend something, and then you'll have a tabloid which will run an article based on that and completely miss the point. and then all of a sudden the message gets completely misconstrued. Or tabloids are quite, renowned for making outlandish generalizations off one study, which is which then.
But the same could be said for social media now, couldn't it? Like you could get a PT that is focused on fat loss, or let's say, I'm gonna go a bit more specific here, an American social media personality who is focused on biohacking, and therefore takes this recommendation from the World Health Organization to form it into their narrative or pull it into their narrative so that they can sell more of their product because it creates more of a scaremongering effect. Well, you shouldn't be having non-nutritive sweeteners, so therefore you should buy my biohacking plan, which will teach you how to eat all of the foods that you enjoy without any of the restriction, that sort of thing. And essentially, the tabloidism of days gone by is kind of similarly replicable with individuals in their own echo chambers online these days. And that's where I think in our space, we've seen people that are vehemently on one side of the coin where say, no, you can't do these things because of this, that, and the other. Or people that say, oh, well, yeah, you can compete the CrossFit Games and win Ironman. Well, it's not quite that simple. So from your perspective, where is the research adequate to make blanket statements at the moment, yes or no?
No. It's certainly not. I don't know if it ever will be.
Could it ever be?
I'm not really sure, because every time you do a study, you're going to make some slight change into how you've structured the intervention, the methods, whatever it might be. And there are a million and different ways you could do that. And then add on top of the fact that I could do the same study like 5 times with 5 different groups of people that are in the same category as, let's say, moderately trained, and I might get different results for each one. So just because you have to account for luck and just, even though in a study you're trying to control as many variables as possible, there's still going to be some variability in just day-to-day life and human variability. So, you've got to take that into account when you're making these grand generalizations. In terms of what I think the concurrent training or the hybrid training space really needs, really would be around how people respond to varying combinations of training variables such as intensity, volume, frequency, all of those types of things. The reason being, let's have if we think about just the molecular interference effect, okay, or your molecular response to training. So there was a particular study where they had trained powerlifters and trained cyclists, and they got both groups to do the same training session, resistance training session, and the same endurance training session, completely separate, but they monitored what kind of molecular response they had. And they found that the powerlifters, when they did the resistance training, the sort of like molecular response to initiate protein synthesis was really low. But you'd think, really, why? But you did it in the cyclists, and the molecular response for protein synthesis was really high. And likely the reason being is because the stress from the training is much more new or novel to the cyclists. So, that's a really quite important thing. So if I'm doing the strength programming part of a hybrid athlete, I know that I could program different types of sessions. One may be really high intensity, one might be sort of like quite high intensity but also high volume, which you might be trying to push hypertrophy, or it might be just sort of like a lower intensity, more, I don't want to say structural, but assistant type workout. And the molecular response to each of those is going to be completely different based on the level of that athlete. And then if that's the case, then if there's ever any molecular interference effect, their response or individual response is going to be different, and therefore will have a different effect on the interference effect. Sorry, that's really quite a mouthful.
Makes sense though. You're saying that kind of exposure to the to the methodology or to the intervention that you're trying to understand in of itself is going to affect the outcome regardless of what it is you're trying to measure, because the efficiency or that exposure in the first place is going to determine how they respond, regardless of whether that's an interference effect or whether it's just a novel effect. Is kind of where you're coming from. So I suppose, do you think that the best thing to do then would be to find and study people who have, a history of exposure to the interventions themselves.
Yeah, certainly.
And use them as the study group, and or to reduce maybe to look at the molecular responses across these kind of divergent interventions, and make them simpler or something. I don't know. I mean, which way around would you think would be better?
It'd be really interesting to see if we're thinking of like this plasticity in terms of, if you're quite used to the stimulus, you won't have as much of a molecular response to it. Then that's obviously going to influence how you program. Because, but then I would like to, like with that previous study, let's say we've got the cyclists, we've got the powerlifters. Let's throw CrossFitters in. Let's throw hybrid athletes in. Do they respond completely different because they're so used to that combination of both strength training and endurance training? Does their response mean, okay, how I would program training for them because of their training history will be completely different to like a powerlifter that's getting into hybrid training, or a cyclist that's getting into hybrid training? And I think from that we can then push the boat just as to how much training we could potentially get in without having diminishing returns into the overall performance. Because if we do that over a long period of time, we'd be able to see how far hybrid training can potentially go. So yeah, we need to do studies which use more trained hybrid athletes, and that really investigate the manipulation of those sort of training variables which we are doing anyway in our everyday programming, to try and find what the best combinations could be to actually see how far we can take hybrid training.
If budget was limitless and you didn't have any marking, any admin, any travel, any bureaucracy to deal with at St. Mary's.
Oh, the dream.
Not that that's you complaining to us, but just I assume that's how an academic setting works.
Mm-hmm.
What would the study be? If the world was your oyster, paint a picture for us as to what you would like that study to be.
Wow. Right, let me try and rather than describe it, let's try and think of the key things that need to happen in it. So, one, let's have the study last over several seasons, several years. So many studies, if you did a 20-week study, you're doing a very good job. Intervention studies are hard. Dropout rates are very high. So you see so many people that do sort of 4-week, 8-week, maybe even 12-week. But we know that most of the time, because if we start with a new training program, that athlete's probably going to improve anyway, because the training program, the combination of all that training stress is new to them. So as long as it's not stupid, they're probably going to progress really well. But we don't really know how that carries on over time. So this program needs to be long. It would be great to have a inclusion criteria where the hybrid athletes say they need to squat over 200 kilos and they need a sub 5-minute mile. I mean, that's quite a high end inclusion criteria. So it'd be interesting.
Pretty limited pool, but yeah.
But a lot of the time when these studies make these big generalizations to everyone, they don't apply to the elite pool at the top. There's so many studies which say, improve your VO2 max and you'll get better at this CrossFit WOD. It's like, well, you use very average athletes, like just making them fitter or make them better at any CrossFit WOD. So, if we can target that particular participant, we could then have like this, okay, we won't train you like that yet, but we know where we want to take you. And then I would, in terms of what I would want to collect, to need to have some method of determining neuromuscular fatigue, because residual fatigue, chronic fatigue is a big factor when it comes to how successful a hybrid training is. And it'd be interesting to actually test for the molecular responses to the training. That would be cool. But I'm sure the athletes wouldn't like that, because then they've got to have chunks of muscle taken out of them, which is painful. I've never had a biopsy, but it's painful, I hear.
That's very catabolic, to be fair. That is pure catabolism, isn't it? Having muscle literally cut it.
Yeah. The catabolic effect of a biopsy might be a separate study. The interesting thing that pops out to me from this is I suppose I mentioned it a minute ago, would be that if you can normalise, and this is going into your sort of limitless study here, is if you could then normalise that response, then you'd be able to kind of look at that, normalise that kind of novel, take that out of the equation and use these kind of more elite level athletes that you're describing. Then you're then able to look probably more specifically at what the actual molecular response is, because if you have a kind of an overly what's the word I'm looking for? Magnified response from an endurance-based activity on an athlete that's used to kind of power production and strength alone, then how that affects the opposite isn't going to be the same, is it? It's not actually, it's valid information in the body of information that we've got, but it'd be exciting to see that across the board, because then you can say, okay, so this is where the interference effect really kicks in, where we can, if there is one, etc., etc. I think at the moment, as you've described well, we're looking at studies where the intervention doesn't include the fact that the intervention itself is exclusive. If that's not a back to front way of saying the same thing you did. What about from a fatigue perspective? We discussed in a previous podcast, I think quite earlier on in the podcast, we discussed something.
Yeah, I think it was pre-fatigue, our concept versus the research, or something it was called.
Yeah, and I think that would be something that'd be interesting. I don't know whether or not that would probably require that kind of same participant model. Do you think?
Yeah, certainly. Because you'd like to think that that participant would recover very quickly from that particular fatigue, or they have some kind of mechanism which means that the effect of residual fatigue, like remember, this could be more central or more peripheral. There's going to be a complete difference. So that will be something interested to look at. But yeah, they seem to, it doesn't affect them as much. So then all of a sudden they're able to train and still get the same type of physiological adaptation from it, despite having fatigue there. Because, you know, the thought of being 100% all the time is never really going to happen. And if that's your approach, then you're probably not going to get enough training to reach not enough training to reach the real heights that you potentially could get in hybrid training. So, yeah, I think fatigue will be quite a big area to look into.
Interesting. I do wonder what fatigue management in 20, 30 years from now is going to look like, because I'm sure having a device on your wrist that monitored your heart rate all the time, gave you HRV overnight, monitored your respiratory rate, all these things 10, 15 years ago just seemed impossible. But if there was a way of actually monitoring systemic and localized and fatigue response in individuals and athletes, and from a tech point of view, that's an exciting concept. And I don't see any way from a technological point of view how we get there. But then again, I don't really understand how people can build bridges. So, not metaphorically, when I see a big bridge, I'm like, how did they build that without draining the water? And then my brain starts to fall apart and I just stop asking questions and move on. So it's not for me to solve that problem, but fatigue is a big one, because we talk about it a lot, don't we, Johnny, in terms of MRV, in terms of how fatigue masks fitness, but there's no real measurable, metric-focused way of looking at this other than spotting the symptoms, spotting the signs, monitoring the data that is actually tangible, and then making assumptions, informed assumptions, based on the outputs of the individual.
I guess it's, the word tangible kind of speaks to where my mind was going with that, and what you've said already is that it's very difficult. You know, you've got a whoop around your wrist and it's recording certain things. I know you use a Garmin for certain things as well, and so you've got a lot of data that speaks in. But then these external stressors that we try to manage within our coaching business, or try to at least have people be aware of throughout, that's very difficult to manage overall, isn't it? Because, you know, what's going on inside somebody's head can have a physical effect on them, and I don't know where the technology will lead us with that, but it'd be very interesting to find ways to say, you know, I am externally stressed today to the point of, you know, X on the scale, which means I'm going to reduce my training by X on that scale, and kind of come out with more or less the same overall stress response, which is favourable to my week of stress. I think it would be exciting to have that happen. Quite an interference to a degree, but I suppose that's time will tell on that one.
I think people expect science to give all the answers to the point where, oh, you're fatigued by this much, well, change your training by this much, like it's to an exact point.
Yeah,
and I don't think it will ever reach that way. We always say that coaching is a bit like an art, putting it all together.
Yeah.
It's guided by science, but if it was just pure science, you just follow that recipe. We don't have that, and the human body and lifestyle is way too unpredictable to fully know that. So you are making assumptions whatever you do, which I think is quite a nice thing. If everything was so well predicted, it would be quite boring.
I agree, yeah.
If you look at it from as if it was music, you could look at music very mathematically.
Here he goes. Here he
Really,
goes.
It's the same thing, isn't it? You could look at music very mathematically and come out with something that on paper should be a beautiful piece of music, but without the art, without the love, and without the soul in it, you're not going to feel it the same way. And I think the same applies there, mate. I think you're right. There is an art in coaching. There's an art in training, and there's a beauty in it. And there's things that we've discussed throughout this podcast many times in what you get from it, how you feel about it. Those days that are harder versus other days could be the same training session. One Monday to the next Monday was the best session you've ever had, and then the following Monday is the most dreadful session. You never want to do it again. And that's based on so many intangible things that there comes a point where you think, well, I don't really want them to be tangible, because that's the beauty is in the journey, isn't it? The experience of it all, getting it wrong included, is wonderful. But to your PhD, there's also some beauty in being able to kind of box some of that stuff in, so that you can take away the stuff that's absolutely nailed down by science, and say, well, we know how to manage this, and that leaves more room for the beauty. That's how poetic of me.
To put a topical spin on it, following your poetry, Johnny, this is why the whole narrative, if anyone spends even half a second on LinkedIn, I'm sure they know what I'm talking about, on AI taking over the world, taking all these jobs, doesn't really fill me full of dread or fear like it does some people that work in service-based businesses or in more interactive focused industries, because at the end of the day, human beings crave human beings. We crave interaction, we crave humanity. And whilst yes, AI could create a new Drake song by learning everything about Drake from over the years and spitting something out the other end, as human beings, we don't value that as much, because it doesn't have the storytelling of the human behind it. And I think that's something that'll never change, in the same way that, yes, I understand obviously evidence-based training, evidence-based nutrition is absolutely the way forward, but I also don't really vibe very much with the camp on social media and the industry that sort of, like, if you can't reference a statement online with a PubMed reference, then you're not allowed to say it. Or, well, no, that can't possibly work because this research study says this, and there's no research to support what you've said. It's like, well, the wider context around that, and actually the fact that nobody's actually funded that yet, and not everything is as black and white. And I think it can be a form of shackling yourself to a false promise in the hope that science, as you said, Phil, is going to give you all the answers, when really it doesn't. It just gives you the framework in which to make your own balanced considerations.
Indeed. Nicely put. And hopefully people on social media will start following that. But we shall see.
We shall. And they won't. They won't. But we shall see. We shall see. Shan't we, gentlemen? Johnny, were you going to say something about music and Drake there?
I don't know whether this is, from a LinkedIn perspective, whether this is born out of the same AI experience, but Notorious B.I.G. just dropped a freestyle cover of of Lil Nas. God, I forget the name of the track. And I was halfway through listening to it.
Hold on. No, something Road, that one. Or was it one of his newer ones?
Remember what it was. No, it was from the late 90s. So how the hell did he manage that? It was AI, but it sounded so real. So I was sitting listening to Notorious B.I.G. dropping a track.
But as soon as you know, it's not real.
Yeah, and that was the interesting thing.
Engage with it as much, do you?
Yeah. So, but the knowing was the difference, and that's where all the commentary came underneath. Was like,
drum roll. We have another podcast topic. Dr. Phil, Johnny Payne. I think our next podcast conversation will be on how do we think AI is going to affect the fitness industry, and we're all going to sit here and go, we don't fucking know.
It depends.
But I think that'll be a fun discussion. It depends. It does indeed depend. If you think we should make an It Depends t-shirt for you avid podcast listeners out there, then send us a message on social media. And if there are enough messages, it shall be done. And after
it
all,
depends for a free t-shirt.
well,
no,
yeah,
wait a minute, not free. Wait a minute, I ruined that already.
Johnny, shut up. Just get back to listening to dead artists play new songs. I think that's as good a place to finish as any, really. I think to summarise, the research is out there. Take everything with a pinch of salt and appreciate the wider context. Use it to inform your own opinions based on your empirical understanding of things. Always be aware that research is not ever complete. It is always ongoing and evolving. Use it to frame your perceptions. Don't lock yourself too much into a box or dig yourself too deep into a hole that you lose sight of everything else. And make sure to follow and subscribe and follow us all on social media. I think that was the main takeaway, wasn't it? That one?
I guess you could also become an extraordinary hybrid athlete and then look forward to being part of one of Phil's future research studies.
Exactly.
Because,
we need essentially
he's
Phil.
looking for
I've said the
real
criteria.
deal.
Now go get it.
Phil is looking to create the Terminator franchise, by the sounds of things.
T1000.
Yeah. What's the name of the company that ruined the world in
Skynet.
Terminator? Skynet. Yeah. So
Philnet.
Phil is clearly the boffin. Yeah, Philnet. This is an alternative reality where you take the people that can squat 200 kilos and run a sub 5-minute mile, give them some sort of Captain America, put them in a spinny thing, supercharge them up, and then let them loose in the world, and then oh no. Add in a sprinkling of AI, as we've discussed, and then there you go. You've got Arnold Schwarzenegger, pretty much.
We're right where it started, in 1980.
Oh no. Okay, well, existential crises as a 3 aside. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. We hope that has been informative. Do all the podcasty stuff. Any questions? Please feel free to reach out. It depends. Let us know if you do feel that it truly does depend. And we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.